Hey, welcome. This background fireplace sound is called Embers, created by my good friend Mew, and is featured as a background sound option over on Chilling. Go check it out, along with the many others we have available there. There will only be one mid-roll ad in this video, after this message and before the story begins. This is a standalone, epic story of an antique puppet that is better kept away from your family, and especially your kids. Written by T.J. Lee. I give you Mr. Promises. I've always considered myself to be a good dad. Patient, understanding, a good communicator, and strict but fair. That's how I wanted to be with my own boy as he grew up. And it's never that simple though, is it? You always have this image in your mind of how it'll be when you're idly thinking about fatherhood or seriously thinking about with your partner. But when it actually comes along and they aren't the picturesque baby that you envisioned, you realize the world you had in your head comes crashing down and you're going to mess up on more than one occasion. Most dads don't sit at their sons' hospital beds praying for their recovery as a result of said mess-ups, though. To explain how we got to this point, I have to take you back to my own childhood. I was around 10. My mom and dad had grounded me for TPing Mr. Watterson's house again, and ordered me to clear out the attic, finding things old and new to sell for a yard sale, as a way of ensuring I would learn from my error in judgment. I still thought what I had done was hilarious. Mr. Watterson was not a nice guy. Mr. Watterson was a jerk, but it definitely taught me to resist the urge in the future after saying goodbye to my Famicom. While clearing out some of the contents of my back heirlooms, I stumbled across one of those old Japanese dolls known as bunraku. It was at least 100 years old, the paint smeared and cracked around the edges, the flesh-colored skin giving way to a more rotten wooden hue. My grandfather must have gotten it during his time in Japan during the war, because my dad had no patience for cultural knickknacks, and I knew my mom would hate this sort of thing after seeing Chucky. His name was Mr. Promises, and the tag attached to it, written in crude English, read, "A companion for all time. He will fulfill any promise you have, with only one string attached." I looked down and saw that someone had affixed a pull string to him, clearly long after he was finished. I rolled my eyes at the terrible pun and pulled the string. It extended out farther than I was expecting before hitting the snag and reversing in slowly, a raspy but authoritative voice ringing out.
"Greetings. Have you a wish? Most fortunate. Mr. Promises shall carry it out. Simply speak the name of your ire and pull the string for that fulfilled desire."
I shrugged, thought of how Mr. Watterson had seen me throwing the toilet paper over his house that night, and in my 10-year-old brain, blamed him for me getting in trouble. So I pulled the string once more and said, "Mr. Bill Watterson." A sharp sound of a Japanese drum being hit rang out, and the doll moved to assume a prayer position.
"With one swift motion, Mr. Promises has carried out your wish. Now you must fulfill my own. Pull the string again to finish this deal and begin to atone."
"Forget this," I scoffed, putting the doll back into the box I found it in and finishing my clean of the attic. After another hour or so, I went downstairs to tell my mom and dad I had finished, but I didn't find them in the kitchen. Instead, I noticed our front door was ajar, and the two of them were standing in shock as blue flashing lights and several police cars and ambulances sat with engines running as the police took strategic positions behind their cars. They held fast at the front door, the curtains half drawn, blood splattering the edges. "Dad? What's going on?" I walked up and stood slightly back from the gap between them, the feeling of danger in the air. Looks like Mr. Watterson has had an issue with his wife and the police were called. He shifted and looked at me, smiling. I'm sure it'll be fine, buddy. Head up to your room. I was about to turn on my heel when Mr. Watterson's blood-covered sweater caught my eye as he stumbled into view, leaning against his front door frame with the blood of his wife coating his face, an almost trance-like state in his eyes as he shakily held a 12-gauge shotgun in his free hand. As he pulled the door open, he leaned against the door frame and showed the twitching body of his wife, laying in their hallway. Mr. Watterson, please surrender yourself calmly. I will give you until the count of 5 to put your weapon down, or we will be forced to shoot. The officer in charge called back, unwavering authority in his voice as the men beside him held their guns steadily. Is it done? His timid voice called back, the fear obvious even from this distance. Is what done, Mr. Watterson? The officer replied. No sooner had he done so, his deputy's screaming voice rang out as he shouted, Don't! Mr. Watterson stood for a moment, his body shaking from side to side before he nodded, and in one swift motion, raised the shotgun up to his lips, pulling the trigger, his body standing for a moment before slumping forward in a sickening thud. While the whole incident was burned into my brain, despite my mom and dad turning to shield me too late, it wasn't the gore and the violence that scarred me. No, it was something far more intrinsic than that. It was the far-off look in Mr. Watterson's eyes and where they were directed that disturbed me. They were looking into my attic. Naturally, after I calmed down and composed myself, I tried to talk to my father about the doll I found in the attic, but he dismissed it immediately. Mr. Watterson had his issues, and they got to him, Jacob. Nothing more. That was all I could get out of him before the issue became borderline taboo to discuss. My family would never speak of it again, and subsequently, it was forgotten, relegated to a subject that we dared not to broach, lest the awkward silence fill the air and ruin any future gatherings. Time passes. The street moves on, and someone else fills the house the Wattersons once occupied. I get older, and as is tradition, move out as my life takes me to opportune places. I'd say it's been about 30 years since that summer afternoon, and it wasn't something I gave much thought to until I returned to my family home, a new generation in tow. My father had recently died, and my mother was now in palliative care, so it was up to me and my son to take over the house. I separated from my wife, and so this was seen as making the best of a bad situation by all parties involved. My son Isaac was initially unhappy to be moving across state and changing schools, but he warmed up to the idea when I promised him pizza every night for the first week that we were there. He was a good kid, my spitting image, right down to the freckles on his nose and his precociousness. I began unpacking everything in the home and separating all of our things. I must admit that it was hard to see my entire life in just a few moving boxes, the entirety of an irretrievable marriage carelessly thrown in with mismatched objects. I loved my wife, Sadie, but her drinking was getting the better of her judgment, and after coming home from work to discover Isaac with a cut on his forehead caused by falling through the coffee table and a blackout drunk Sadie in the bedroom, I decided enough was enough. The proceedings didn't take long, and I was awarded full custody. I promised her that we would visit if she went into a rehab center, and I left soon after. If Isaac felt anything, he didn't show it, but I did my best to communicate with him on a grown-up level, knowing full well that kids pick up on far more than we realize. Like any 7-year-old, though, his mind was easily fixated on the next important thing in his immediacy, and, while on the way here, it was making friends or liking his room. It rapidly shifted to picking out where he wanted to put his bed and his toys. His energy was infectious, and I told him to go pick out any room he wanted, hoping it may make him settle easier. A few hours passed and the unpacking was mostly done, but I hadn't heard anything from Isaac the entire time. Curious, I started scouring the house looking for him, wondering where he might be. I heard him laughing above me and felt a degree of unease as I could hear it coming from the attic. I turned down the hall and saw the hatch to it was wide open, an oversight on the cleaner's part, I imagine. Ascending the stairs, Isaac's voice rang out clearer, and what I was hearing made the hairs on my neck stand on end. "So what do I call you? My name is Isaac Fitzroy," he said with that ever-present enthusiasm. The sound of a cord being pulled cut through the air before a horribly familiar voice replied back.
Mr. Promises, have you a wish to be fulfilled?
It sounded exactly the same from my childhood. But was the phrase always that short? Before Isaac could reply, I reached the top of the steps and he turned to me, smiling. I tried to feign happiness, forcing the edges of my smile to curl up in spite of my fear. "Hey, bud, who are you talking to?" I asked, knowing full well the response I was about to receive. "He's called Mr. Promises. Is this one of your toys, Dad?" He beamed at me, clutching the ever-disturbing Bunraku doll tightly in his hand. I shook my head, the request that he leave it there about to leave my mouth, when he interjected. "Can I keep him? He seems really cool." You have to understand, my incident was a long time ago, to the point where in that moment I was, as an adult, willing to do what most of us do when we're confronted with uncomfortable truths, push it to the back of my mind and lie to myself. So, when my son who had just left his old life and mom behind wanted a keepsake to make him happy, well, who was I to refuse? I nodded and told him if he helped me with the last of the unpacking, he could keep him. He was overjoyed and agreed. The next few days were relatively peaceful. We got on with our lives and it seemed Isaac was adjusting well. I would occasionally catch him talking to the doll, as if it were an imaginary friend, but the conversations always seemed to fall within the realms of what a kid usually talked about when playing, so I didn't think much of it. I'll admit, when hearing Mr. Promise's voice lines in response, it was almost comical. Isaac needed the confidence boost, and if that was found within a creepy doll from my childhood, well, that'd be fine by me. His happiness was most important. Over time, though, I began to observe small changes in him, things that at first didn't fall out of the ordinary spectrum of misbehavior. Breaking a toy in a fit of anger, or throwing a tantrum because something didn't go his way. And in those cases, I would just sit him down and talk to him about how he felt, which ended with a hug and an apology. But then things escalated. He would punch holes in the drywall, break his furniture, and even throw rocks at stray animals. Every time I confronted him about it, he would tell me that Mr. Promises told him to do it, and that it was part of his secret game, quote-unquote. When I pressed him for more information, he would look up to his room where Mr. Promises resided, look back to me, and shake his head slowly and intentionally. This frustrated me, but as a single parent trying to adjust to a new life, all I felt I could do was talk to him and try to take away anything he loved for a short period of time. Last week, however, two things happened that would change the very course of our lives. First, in a completely out-of-the-blue attack, he bit the babysitter while I was at work and did enough damage that she had to be sent to the hospital. I was furious when I got the news and took him straight from our neighbors to our living room to scold him. But even my anger couldn't match his. He was kicking the walls openly, trying to throw anything he could get his hands on. It took his eyes darting around towards the top of the stairs for him to completely fall inert, his entire demeanor shifting and becoming that of a timid boy once again. I lost. I lost the game. He's going to be so mad at me, Dad. I'm sorry, please don't punish me," he begged. I was confused, but eager to help him, no matter the cost or the stress. "I'm not going to punish you harshly, Isaac, but you have to apologize to the babysitter, okay? And what game are you playing?" I held his shoulders and made sure I looked him in the eye when I asked, fearing someone was putting pressure on him to misbehave, without my realizing it. "I'll tell her I'm sorry, but I'm not being punished by you," he replied, his voice shaking. "I'm being punished by Mr. Promises. I can't tell you about the game. I'll get into more trouble." Alarm bells now ringing, I sat on the floor and ran my hand through his hair to placate him, promising him he would be safe with me if he trusted me. "You do trust me, right?" I asked, hoping that things weren't any worse than what I already feared. It took a moment, but sheepishly, he put a small note in my hands before looking back at the floor. The words, "The Road to Promises," written in crude black crayon on the front. Sensing his shame, I decided not to make him stand there while I read the note. "Go get ready for bed, buddy. I'll come tuck you in. Everything will be okay, I promise." He nodded, walking off to the stairs and repeatedly saying, "I'm sorry," under his breath. When he was out of view, I opened the note and felt the bile rise in my throat at every sentence. The Road to Promises. Mr. Promises is doing this for your own good. Follow these instructions like any good boy should. Every 12 hours there will be a new challenge, and for every challenge that you succeed, I will bring you closer to what you need. For every challenge you fail, a punishment you will entail. The game starts now, but do not fret. All pain is temporary. Yours hasn't happened yet. Your finest possession you must break. For we truly grow when our hearts begin to ache. When the penultimate game is done, pass this to the Father. With love from the Son, Mr. Promises will be waiting. Elder Fitzroy, will you be participating? My hands shook as I gripped the letter, but I decided acting now would be too much for him, and that it was better to deal with in the morning. I sat with him and read his favorite stories until he finally fell asleep, still occasionally telling me he was sorry under his breath. As I left, I saw Mr. Promises sitting on his shelf, looking down and across the room at the sleeping Isaac. Disgust filled me, and I took him quietly from Isaac's room and put him back in the attic for the night, electing to tell Isaac that he had gone missing in the night. Everything in me was screaming to keep him away from my son, and until I understood what he was, at least I could put him far away from his prying hands. Settling in for bed that night, I had no idea the mistake I had made. It was a few hours later when I woke to the sound of a soft scraping coming from somewhere in the house. Being a parent and coupled with recent events, my mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario, and I leapt out of bed and listened intently for the sound again. It was coming from below me. I followed it down towards the kitchen and the sounds became more intense, the scraping accompanied by whimpering. Turning the corner, I was greeted with the horrifying sight of my son running a blade across the back of a stray cat. "Isaac, what are you doing?" I tried to contain myself, but urgency and shock overcame me as my voice began to rise. His arm stopped as he was bringing the knife down, and he remained still. The entire atmosphere was tense. He was just a boy, but I knew I had to be careful with how I approached this, especially when he had a weapon. there was something else I couldn't shake. There, in the dead of night. I felt like I had to be on guard, not just from my son, but from something else. Isaac, look at me, son. I need you to listen, I began, crouching down to his level but keeping a safe distance, my voice lowering back to a calm state. We can talk about this, and I promise you that I won't get mad, but you have to put the knife down, okay? Let him go. I took a small shuffle forward, and I heard the smallest of cracks. Isaac's finger shot up from his free hand and pointed towards me, wagging in place as if to ward me away. Was my son in a trance? He had never shown this kind of behavior before, save for the occasional nightmare. Isaac, is someone putting you up to this? Are they here with you? I asked softly, another step forward and focused on keeping the atmosphere calm. He was sat near the center of the kitchen, and I wasn't able to spot what was behind the island. When he nodded, though, I stopped moving and felt my muscles tighten. My cell was upstairs, and I had no weapons on me. The alarm hadn't gone off, and there was no signs of a break-in. It was, he started, but a gruff voice rang out from behind him.
Young Fitzroy, that would be most unadvisable. Our game is not yet done. Speak out now and Mr. Promises will hold you liable. Remember, you have not yet won.
Isaac fell silent again, and tears began to run down his face. My blood ran cold, and the feeling of danger mounted with every second I kept my son near that godforsaken doll. Where is he, Isaac? Another step. I'm within arm's reach. Where is Mr. Promises? Isaac shook his head, whimpering and muttering. No, I can't. Under his breath, with more and more panic, each time his voice cracking a little more. It's okay, buddy. We will get through this, I promise. I began to reach out slowly for the knife when a sick laugh emanated from behind the counter, the sound of the cord reverting. Now! The voice bellowed as Isaac lunged forward and drove the knife into my shoulder. Pain erupted through my body as my vision began to blur, and the sight of my only son's anguish-ridden face, inches from mine, intermixed as he pushed me to the ground, pinning the knife into me before running toward the door. Upside down, I could still see as he pulled the door to a close and whispered, I'm so sorry, Dad, before letting it shut.
Long have I waited, patiently, with breath so bated. Elder Fitzroy, you made a promise, it's true. Now.
I heard the clicking and scraping of wood as something began lumbering from behind the counter. Out of my vision and towards me, the first hand grabbed my leg, and then the other pulled itself up my torso, the clicking getting louder as it reached my neck. A pair of spindly hands pulling on my chin before a twisted, demonic face glared down at me. Gone were the human features of the Bunraku doll, instead replaced with pale skin, yellow piercing eyes, and an unhinged jaw filled with at least 3 rows of black, small teeth.
Now you must fulfill your promise before the night is through. Your son's final challenge that is already due.
Its jaw crunched and clicked horrifically as it threatened to get closer, the raspy laughter filling the kitchen. The pain in my chest was nothing compared to the sheer terror running through my mind in that moment. I swatted the puppet away with everything I had, pulling the knife from my shoulder and rushing towards the door, slamming it shut behind me. The instinctual fear of a parent overcame me. I ran straight to Isaac's room and saw the door was shut and not budging. I knocked frantically for Isaac to open up, but there was no reply. Every eventual horrific outcome filled my mind as the cackling from downstairs continued. I looked around for something tangible to help me bust the door open when my eyes fell on the bathroom door. It was ajar. Oh no, no. I began, my anxiety building, and I rushed to confirm my worst suspicions. The medicine cabinet had been raided. I took a couple steps back and rammed my body into the door with full force. It barely budged on the first occasion, my shoulder rushing with pain. No matter. Try again. I reared back and through gritted teeth pushed again, the door giving way as I stumbled through. In the corner lay my boy, a half-empty bottle of pills on his side, and his body twitching. I called the ambulance in a haze and watched as they took him away, not even having the energy to ask to sit in the ambulance with him. I felt like I had failed him completely as a father. A neighbor drove me to the hospital where I sat, waiting to be let in to see my boy. I decided to use that time to call our family and let them know what had happened. While my wife didn't pick up, my mother did. The moment I heard her voice, I felt the walls coming down. Everything I had bottled up rushed to the surface as the fear of what was going on in and out of my control overwhelmed me. Mom, Isaac isn't doing so well, I began, trying to keep my composure. He's taken a bunch of pills and, well, he's not been all right for a couple weeks. I'm not sure why. Honey, I'm sure you're doing your best with him. Adjustments can be tough. It was hard on you too back then, she soothed, trying her best to be comforting from a distance. You were never the same after Danny died. Danny? Who's Danny, Mom? I asked, hoping she wasn't about to slip into a forgetful patch. I knew she couldn't help it, but I needed my mom at that moment. There was a pause before she replied. Danny Watterson, your best friend? You used to see him every day until that summer afternoon when Bill did what he did. We should have never let you play over at his house. Your father blamed himself for that until his dying day. You know? My stomach contracted, and my hand shook as I held the phone to my ear. Ma, I was at home when that happened. I stood behind you and Dad when it all went down because I was cleaning out the attic, remember? I had TP'd Mr. Watterson's house because... No, honey. You were at their house because he had told you could help clean the house as punishment. Danny did it as a prank, and you offered to help your best friend. You were in the house that day when Bill... I felt sick. I began to remember things that I had long blocked out. Danny showing me the doll from his attic. Him wishing his dad was dead so he wouldn't put his hands on him again. The ensuing violence while I hid upstairs and clutched Mr. Promises. And then I recalled that moment I heard the gunshots. The visceral shriek from Danny's mom as she was blasted. The sounds Danny made as he was dragged from the top of the stairs near the attic entrance to his room. A pillow placed over him. And a muffled gunshot rang out. A manic voice ringing out as he called for me, while I sat motionless in his attic. I remembered Mr. Promises being next to me. I remembered pulling the cord and wishing to survive beyond anything else. Mr. Promises clapped his hands together, and in that moment, I forgot Danny and I continued my life as normal. But I never fulfilled my end of the bargain. Mom, I gotta go. I'll call you as soon as I know more, okay? Thank you. My throat was dry, and I felt my vision blurring from the stress. I put the phone down before I could even hear her reply, and sought out the doctor. "Is he safe? Is my boy safe?" I asked, panic riddling my voice as I controlled every impulse not to rush into the room he was being attended to. "You're lucky you got here when you did, Mr. Fitzroy. Any more pills or any longer and this may have turned out differently." Her kind eyes put me at ease, but I knew something worse was waiting for me. "He's not ready for visitors right now. I would go home if I were you, and we can call you when he's ready." I took her hand in both of mine, tears of relief and of fear filling up as I thanked her profusely. "The moment he's awake, or if anything happens," I began, my voice breaking. "We will call you, yes," she smiled back. I left the hospital, not knowing if it was the last time I would see my son or not, but knowing that the saying of old rang truer in that moment than it ever had before. The sins of the father often do haunt the son. The house was a different entity entirely when I returned. The safety of it as a child and as a parent was totally gone. Windows felt like soulless black eyes. The door still slightly ajar like an inviting mouth, and every step I took felt like I was simply prey, waiting to be devoured by what horror lurked in my own home. The lights were off, and I could see my own dried blood in the hall, a handprint on the stairway, and a trail leading from the kitchen. The door now open. It felt wrong to even be here, but I knew this had to be done. My son's life was more important than my selfish fears and desires to avoid the responsibility I set out all those years ago. "Mr. Promises, I will fulfill my end of the bargain," I called out, still somehow feeling ridiculous, talking to a puppet. But after everything I had seen, it was a small price to pay.
"The Elder Fitzroy has returned. Fulfill his promise, lest a liar get burned."
He jeered, his voice echoing around the house and bouncing off of every corner.
30 years late this fulfillment will be. What will you do if that is not enough for me?
I paused. I didn't know if this would be a fair trade or not. Danny wished for his dad to never lay his hands on him again. Though he got his wish, it came at the cost of his life. Would my wish ultimately have that end, too? "What did my son ask you for?" I called out, Mr. Promises giggling.
He wanted his family to be closer, more secure. So I presented him with a route to ensure that forevermore.
I saw a figure move frantically in the corner of my eye.
In death, your grief will rekindle your love. Your son could indulge too, looking on from above.
It seemed no matter what way I looked at it, this was not a simple trade-off. Something had to give. But as I said, I consider myself a good parent, and that means sacrifice is necessary, right? Whatever it takes, I will fulfill my promise, I replied, standing firm but internally shaking, terrified of what my life would be without my son.
Consider it done, Elder Fitzroy. But if I were you, I'd keep an eye on your boy.
His voice sounded so real. I could hear the dulcet tones, but no breath. I dared not turn around.
I may return one day for a new generation to see. Well, you know what they say. The apple rarely falls far from the rotten tree.
It was another 3 days before Isaac woke up. The doctors said he was lucky to have not sustained any long-term damage from the pills he ingested, though he is still suffering with mild amnesia and doesn't recall much of the last few weeks. He wasn't even sure why we were in this city, and after seeing me, the first thing he asked me was, "Where's Mom?" Suffice to say, it's not gonna be an easy road. I don't know what Mr. Promises is, and I don't know where he went after that deal was struck. But I never heard from him again, nor did he show up in the house. I got my son back, and I wouldn't trade that for any knowledge on what that monster was, so I'll stick with the blessing I have. Speaking of Isaac, the hardest thing wasn't explaining how he got to the hospital or the injuries he had. No. It was telling him that his grandma had passed away while he was asleep. He just couldn't fathom where she had gone and what had happened to her. Though truth be told, I think it's best he simply thinks she's somewhere peaceful. A secret I will have to bear for the rest of my life. I hope that Mr. Promises doesn't one day pay a visit to Isaac when he's older. As the saying goes, like father, like son.